Hi, this is Christina Ivy, a member of LANS, presenting this edition of our weekly update. Remember to check out our website at jalans.org and follow us on Twitter at lans_ja. Our first topic this week is Central Westmoreland MP George Wright. He was recently captured on video beating a woman with a stool. It's kind of disturbing. The video was widely circulated on social media. I haven't watched it in full, and I'll admit to that because I find videos like that triggering. But according to the Observer, the police dropped the case because both he and the victim refused to cooperate with investigations. This isn't unusual for domestic violence cases. Like, there are several reasons why a victim might not feel like it's safe to come forward. And knowing what we know about Jamaican police officers and the attitude that they have towards women, like, we can't really be expected to rely on them to deliver justice. In the wake of this video's circulation, many people condemned George Wright and called for his resignation. Some people called for him to be sacked as an MP, but there are actually no provisions for that in our parliamentary system. In fact, this is yet another incident that highlights how difficult our constitution makes it to recall our MPs and senators. In our 2020 general election document, we called for the right to recall our MPs. Similarly, during the Norman Horn scandal, where he was found out to be a US citizen and therefore ineligible to sit in Jamaican Parliament, we called for a process to revoke the appointment of a senator and remove them from office without requiring them to resign. George Wright's actions just further highlight that citizens who lose faith in their representatives should have the right to recall them outside of general elections. At the time of this recording, George Wright is on a leave of absence from Parliament. He can no longer sit in the government benches in the House of Representatives, and during this time, the people of Central Westmoreland have no representation in Parliament, and there's no timeline for when they might expect to have representation again. Another sobering topic this week is that people's families cannot afford to bury them, so much so that funeral homes are now offering services on hire purchase. So one funeral home requires proof of income, a letter from a justice of the peace, and a guarantor. And like, I realize some persons in the informal sector might not be able to access hire purchase plans with these requirements, but that's besides the point. Hire purchase funeral plans should not have to exist. Um, this highlights how destitute a lot of people have become, like in the wake of this pandemic. Life in Jamaica was already difficult and expensive before the pandemic, and now 1 year in, it's just getting harder and harder with no signs of the government providing any relief for its people. This isn't very sustainable for the funeral homes either. Some funeral home directors have pointed out that people don't meet their financial obligations after the burial actually happens because they've already gotten what they want on their end. So this can't be a solution to the fact that people can't afford funerals. And I'm in no way trying to disparage the people that don't pay off these funeral bills, because if you're in a situation where the only way you can afford a funeral and a burial is to take it out on hire purchase, I would assume that you have bigger problems than paying off funeral bills, like bigger priorities like buying food. Another topic for today is some recent reporting by TVJ that the government is considering taking away parental rights from persons who allow their children to work on the streets. Now, this doesn't make any sense, and from what I've seen on social media, no one agrees with this. Everyone agrees that um, this is not the solution to children working on the streets. Child labor comes from like poverty in the family. Like they cannot sustain themselves off of just the income of the parents or most of the time just one parent. So the children have to go out and work. And child labor becomes a problem when children are missing school to work. And school right now is more inaccessible than ever because it's entirely online. So it's not surprising that a lot of parents, to keep up with the bills, are sending their children out to work on the streets. I don't think it should be encouraged, but this is not the solution to the problem of child labor. The solution is providing families with enough income so that they don't have to send their children out to work on the streets. It's also inconsistent with what Robert Morgan, the minister with the responsibility for this area, has said about children in state care and how the government is trying to move away from institutionalization and towards reuniting children with their biological families, and if not their biological families, a family in general. This doesn't seem consistent with that position. Taking away parental rights from people who allow their children to work on the streets doesn't actually solve the problem of children working on the streets. And we know that state care facilities for children are already overcrowded to the point where a lot of them are ending up in adult prisons, even though they've done nothing wrong. We also know about the high levels of abuse of all kinds that occur in these institutions. So, why on earth would we create more laws to separate children from their biological families? It just doesn't make sense. My last topic for this week's update is the US State Department's recent meeting with CARICOM's foreign ministers. One of the main points of discussion for this meeting was climate change. Many countries at the meeting pointed out the high levels of indebtedness of CARICOM countries and the need for them to receive financial assistance as they mount efforts against climate change. Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio went up above 100% last year, not because our debt changed, but because our GDP fell. Other countries are in an even worse position. So Belize has a debt to GDP ratio of 135%. Barbados has a debt to GDP ratio of 148%, and Suriname has 134%. These are all incredibly bad. Having a high debt to GDP ratio isn't inherently bad if you can see that like trade and economic growth is going to cancel it out. But in the case of CARICOM, where most of our economies are reliant on tourism, and we're not really having any tourism now because of the pandemic, this is incredibly unsustainable. That being said, I am still wary of calling on the US for financial assistance or debt cancellation because I'm aware that it's yet another thing that the US might hold over CARICOM states to get us to conform to their will. In the last administration. Disaster relief was one of the first things they threatened to cut off in the event of the Jamaican government engaging Huawei about 5G technology. And that was frightening. There's been a lot of excitement about the US returning to climate leadership, but as others have said, it's actually climate imperialism. They are attempting to secure their legitimacy on this issue after losing it during the Trump administration. But just as before, the measures that they are pushing are performative and they don't serve climate justice.
Signing off now, this has been Christina Ivey, member of Lands, with your weekly update.